Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trudy Hughes, and I'm Associate Director of Disability Services at the System Office. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Margaret Camp. Margaret Camp is the Director of Student Accessibility Services at Clemson University. Okay, and I know we have a few fans from Clemson here. All right, hold the applause down too much. She is a former school psychologist, and she has spent the past 20 plus years working at the university towards social justice for students with disability as an ADA coordinator and disabled student advocate and representative on several campuses around her state. She has served multiple positions at the National Association of Higher Education, or AHEAD, okay, and has mentored many new professionals. Margaret has presented at several national and state conferences and enjoys her personal research in disability in media, inclusion, and neurodivergent students, and professional burnout and resilience. So I'm going to hand it over to Margaret. Before I do, though, I would like to encourage everybody to please turn off your cameras and please mute yourself, okay? You can put your questions in the chat box. And also, I will be taking questions afterwards. We will be taking questions afterwards. And at that point, I will turn off the recording. So feel free to be upfront and honest with your questions. So without further ado, Margaret, it's all yours.
Thank you, Trudy. Please let me know if there's any problems with, if you can't hear me or there's any accessibility issues or concerns. Teams is not the platform that I'm most familiar with. And so, but I know that Trudy has her eye on things, and we'll be keeping up with that as well. But we want to make sure that we're accessible for everyone. Thank you so much for asking me to do this webinar. I first did this last February for AHEAD, the Association on Higher Education and Disability. I had submitted it as a proposal for the AHEAD conference last summer, and they decided it was timely to go ahead and do it as a webinar ahead of time. So when we think back to last year and where we were, I know with my office, it seems like we were in a very different place with burnout and what I came to understand as demoralization. And I think that was reflected a little bit in the survey responses. I received 40 survey responses from folks in the North Carolina community colleges, and it didn't reflect a huge amount of burnout. And I have that in the slides, and we'll talk about that some. I have some theories about, maybe the professionals who were extremely burnout left, and we have new folks now who are chomping at the bit or have not had the opportunity yet to feel burnout. But burnout and demoralization became just really in the forefront of my mind during the pandemic. And I think that what we saw was that happened for a lot of people. And it became kind of, I'm a big fan of the book, The Obstacle is the Way. So the way that you get through something is to sort of stand on the obstacle and learn everything you can about the obstacle. And for me, burnout and demoralization was certainly something that I was dealing with during the pandemic. And sorry, I'm closing down my Outlook so that we won't hear these little messages. So thought I had done that. I apologize. And so maybe you'll hear some things that you can relate to, and I do want us to have time for discussion as well. So the title is From Burnout to Demoralization, the Perfect Storm That Is Raining Resignation. And this is the webinar that I gave and the presentation that I gave at AHEAD, the national conference over the summer. And then I've done some different sessions for different state groups as well. So just an agenda for the session, I'm going to talk about the current state of our work leading into the pandemic, and then the pandemic talk some about what burnout is, what demoralization is, and then what remoralization looks like. So the perfect storm, the reason that that came to my mind for this type of presentation is that a perfect storm, when we talk about something being a perfect storm, it's a situation where each individual weather event would be a weather event on its own. But when they come together in this rare meteorological phenomenon, they combine. And so each one becomes greater in force, and each one becomes something even bigger to be reckoned with. And the interaction is amplified, and the application of it is amplified. The effects of it are amplified, often to the point that it's damaging and even devastating. So what I have seen happening is sort of a perfect storm in our um sorry, somehow I turned on a speaker coach and it's giving me suggestions. Um, so in our work, the work that we do in disability services and in higher education, this is kind of what I feel like I have seen. We have this low pressure system coming up from the high schools, and I'm calling it low pressure not because it doesn't put pressure on us, but I think the pressure on students in high school, the expectations on students has lowered in comparison to what we've seen in past years. Um, I think we hear a lot about this from other folks. We see it on the AHEAD listserv and other listservs about these things that are creeping into our work from high school. Things like mastery models that include accommodations for no low grades, for no non essential work, for a reduction in assignments compared with peers. These students have accommodations that are not going to translate to college. They are really focused on academic success and not on equal access. At the same time, we see that students are not building the resilient skills that we would hope they would have the opportunity to build when they're in high school to take forward with them to college. In my experience, I think we see students are being shielded from failure and being shielded from naturally occurring consequences. And so what happens is that they come to college and they've not had the opportunity to build up that resilience. And so they shatter when something happens, when they get a low grade, when they fail a class, something that requires some resilience and requires some grit. They simply have not the opportunity to build that up has been taken away from them. You know, at one time we talked about helicopter parents because they were kind of hovering around and checking students out and looking, and they were there but not there. They were up above. More recently, we talk about snowplow parents. So instead of trying to just kind of keep an eye on things, they are actually plowing the way. And researcher Brene Brown has a great quote about that. And I think it's later in this presentation where she says that, you know, we're supposed to be preparing the child for the path, but too often we're preparing the path for the child. We're coming in and trying to dictate what that path looks like instead of preparing them for the bumps along the road. I saw that someone did ask if the slides would be shared. Yes, I will make sure the slides are shared or are available to share. In our office, we talk sometimes about the dignity of risk. So the dignity to the student to give them the opportunity to risk it, to get out there and to have some successes and to have some challenges and some failures. And we also talk about the soft bigotry of low expectations, that, you know, are we really serving students when we have very low expectations of them? Are we doing them any favors that way? And then we have all of the characteristics of Generation Z. We call them the loneliest generation. And I'm not going to go through all of these bullet points, but I think that there's a lot of agreement that despite the fact that these students are so very connected via their digital and their social media, all of their technologies, they have really underdeveloped social skills. They have expectations that things will be at their fingertips in an instant, and that things don't take time to put in place because that's the culture they're used to. They're subject to the compare and despair effects of social media. And they're used to having a lot of options to choose from. It never fails to kind of make me laugh when I'm in a meeting with a student and I say, well, here's the way that this works. And they say, well, what are my other options? Well, that is the option. This is the way that we do this. Um, so those generational characteristics. And then we have the high pressure system of parents. So, parents, with the cost of college these days, parents are understandably seeking any advantage for their student. Oftentimes, college is the largest investment that a parent is going to make, more than their house, more than their car. Um, they're going to invest in college. And so, of course, they're looking for advantages. Unfortunately, accommodations have begun to appear to be advantages in a lot of situations. They're seeking more than ever a customized experience for their student, and therefore the college experience seems to take precedence over learning a lot of times. But I want them to have the college experience. They often come in fighting. They are used to being combative in K-12 to get the things that they needed for their student. And so they come in kind of with their fists ready. And so I find that sometimes we have to diffuse them from the beginning and say, we're on the same team here, and we have the same goals. They're very quick to escalate. Well, if you're not going to give us that accommodation, I'd like to speak to your supervisor, or who is the next step up that I can go to. Talk about complaints, litigation, pressure for students to track into a career or a certain degree. I'm sure this is resonating with some folks. So I'm not going to talk about the Varsity Blues scandal because I will talk about it for an hour. I'm obsessed with the Varsity Blues scandal. But one of the things that came out of it, and I think we would have talked much more about it if it hadn't been for the pandemic. It didn't make the headlines that it might have made had it not been during that time. Was, can college admission be purchased? And something that a lot of people don't realize is that it was all about ableism. The roots of it were about getting students into certain colleges for money based on either a made up athletic history that they were extremely able, or a falsified disability that gave them accommodations that allowed them to cheat on the SAT or the ACT. And so ableism was really at the core of that. And it hit us where it hurts in terms of testing. If you haven't watched the Varsity Blues Scandal documentary on Netflix, I highly recommend it. But like I said, I'm not going to go into it here because we don't have time. But I think it also brought up a bigger question in our field, which is, can accommodations be purchased? If college admission can be purchased, can we purchase those accommodations? I think we have to look at expensive private evaluations. I've been a private evaluator before, and there's a lot of pressure, especially if you're charging a high price, to give them something, to take forward besides something that says, congratulations, I didn't find a learning disability. You don't have a disability. Private consultants. It's slowed down a little bit, but we have private consultants who contact us and say, this family would really like for me to come with them to the university. We'd like to meet with someone in your office. These are not matriculated students. These are people who are shopping, and using private consultants to get in the door. Letter mills. It's unfortunate that we have to think about letter mills and false certifications with emotional support animals. To some extent, more recently with ADHD documentation, and then all of this unprecedented pushback that we get. It's a lot. There's a lot going on in our field. And then there's this sort of atmospheric pressure. And I listed here that Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement, the political division that we have had, the Russia-Ukraine war. We entered the pandemic in the middle of an extremely politically, socially, and emotionally charged atmosphere. And we find within that there are pockets of unity. All of these, the Me Too movement, Time's Up, Black Lives, those are all pockets of unity, but they also create division as well. So just a lot of rough edges, a lot of feelings and a lot that's swirling around for this perfect storm to create the conditions for it. So the pandemic, and I have a picture of a turtle on its back, which is how I felt for a lot of the pandemic. Um, so the pandemic really brought our worst fears right into our homes and our work and just right in front of our faces. So if you look at the top 10 fears, the top 10 stressors, things that cause extreme stress for us, they include all of these that we felt during the pandemic: fear of change, tremendous changes, fear of isolation. We were all isolated. Fear of sickness, either ourselves or our loved ones, death, fear of uncertainty, of failure, fear of being unable to protect each other, inadequacy, rejection. All of these fears were highlighted by the pandemic, were brought out by the pandemic, and hijacked this natural fight or flight response for so many of us. The anxiety that we experienced during the pandemic was a different type of anxiety. And it was not until I came across this book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky, that talked about the difference between episodic and chronic stress. And the point that he was making was that zebras don't feel stress when there's not a predator chasing them. They don't feel this chronic ongoing stress. They're either happy and they're down by the water hole, or they're, sitting in the sun, or they're under stress because something is threatening them. But these ulcers that we develop, and what was happening during the pandemic, was this kind of curtain of lingering anxiety. We didn't know if it was safe to go in the grocery store. Is it safe to go and visit people that you care about and love? Is it safe to go back to work? People were called back to work early. And so I read one article where the author said the only way that they can really describe it, the only thing similar, is battlefield anxiety, because you don't know where the enemy is and where a hit could be coming from. And so you're just constantly hyper vigilant, and you have this ongoing invisible destruction. Cascading disaster is another term that I heard used. And I think it was hard to identify it as loss in the beginning because it was so ambiguous. It was not necessarily, a lot of people lost loved ones, but it was a loss of our routine. It was a loss of our way of life that maybe we were comfortable with. It was a loss of our solutions that we can usually fall back on. It was a loss of trust in our institutions, a loss of freedom to move about our lives, and a loss of work-life balance. And that one is so important and is very foundational to burnout. And I remember when we first went into the pandemic, and they told us that we were going to be at home for 2 weeks, and I told my folks, my staff, I bet they call us back before 2 weeks is up. Well, boy, was I wrong. But it was 2 years before we ended up going back. But in the beginning of the pandemic, working from home, it was kind of neat. It was kind of cool. I remember thinking, I just did a load of laundry between student meetings, or I just met with a student for a welcome meeting and I was sitting in my driveway, and I had a background up so they didn't even know, or I was sitting on the deck. Or something like that. I just got this done, and it felt really kind of neat. Like I had no idea I could work from home. But I remember the day that I came downstairs during the pandemic and all of my stuff was on the kitchen table, which is where I was working from. And I saw it all piled there. And I thought, I am no longer working from home. I am living at work. It is always there. It is always waiting for me, and it became not cool anymore. And I stopped feeling like this is so neat. I'm working from home. No, now I feel like I'm living at work. So that may resonate with some folks. So the Great Resignation, by now everybody knows about the Great Resignation. It was coined by a Texas A&M professor, and we've heard it called the Big Quit, institutional churn. Millions of people quit their jobs during the pandemic. And so the effect that that had on the workplace in terms of reskilling and upskilling employees, and the effect that it had in higher education, it oftentimes meant that we were taking on larger workloads because we were trying to fill the gaps for people who had left. And at the same time, trying to run searches to refill those folks. It was a lot. Um, and it's interesting that when faculty would quit, when they would walk out of a lecture and say, I'm not going to do this anymore, I don't feel safe, I don't feel like the institution has my back. When they would quit, it spurned something called Quit Lit, where faculty shared their stories about quitting. And that was important. We saw it in the Chronicle of Higher Education. We saw it in Inside Higher Education. Almost daily stories of Quit Lit, of faculty quitting. We didn't see stories about staff quitting. It was more like they went quietly in the night. And so that's part of demoralization. That's part of the comparison between faculty and staff, and who has importance on campus and who has a voice on campus. I'm going to talk more about that. Um, Response to anxiety. The reason that this in particular became interesting to me, and this, I don't have it here. It comes from The Dance of Connection, and I can't think of the author's name right now, but it should be in the sources at the end. But the underfunctioning, it apparently many of us have a patterned response to managing anxiety, and it often falls into one of two categories. Either we start underfunctioning or we start overfunctioning. And I saw this play out in my office, and I saw myself make this big mistake with an employee who was underfunctioning and was so emotional that she felt like she was feeling so much she couldn't do anything. And I was the opposite. I was doing everything so that I didn't have to feel anything, and micromanaging and forgetting how to delegate anything. And I saw it play out with me saying, let me take this off of you. Well, I'll do this from now on. Let me do this. And that was exactly the wrong response because it continued to diminish the way that she felt about her efficacy at work. We didn't understand these things. We hadn't talked about burnout before, but it's interesting that we have these patterned responses, and the way that they behave together actually makes each of them worse. It meant that I was over functioning so much that I had so much to do I couldn't possibly do it. She was under functioning so much that everything was being taken off of her, and she wasn't able to find joy in her work anymore. So it's interesting the way that those in an emergency situation work together. And when we use the term resignation, I wanted to point out that in this context, resignation can have more than one meaning. Of course, the first place my head goes is you resign. You say, I'm not going to work this job anymore, and you leave. But there's a lot of resignation that is not about just quitting your job. It may be disillusionment. It may be accepting that something's undesirable, but it's inevitable. It may be relinquishing something without struggling. It may be a feeling of resignation. I've got some quotes here. I'm tired of arguing about it. I don't think it's a reasonable accommodation, but I'm not going to argue with the student about it anymore. I'm just tired. I don't have time to consider all these ESA requests. I'm going to approve them and I'm going to let housing deal with it. That's a form of resignation. I guess I just don't get lunch breaks anymore. That's a form of resignation. Or I'm resigned to the fact that administration just is not going to include our voice in higher level decisions. That's a form of resignation. So when I say it's raining resignation, it's not just people leaving, but it's people feeling so overwhelmed and exhausted and saying, I don't have the strength to fight this. And so, what we saw with employee resignation, I've listed out these bullets, but we saw that a lot of employees found that they could be productive working from home and they sought jobs working from home. Their work-life dynamics were reevaluated. They liked spending time with their family or not going on a commute. They liked wearing their pajama bottoms for meetings. They felt like, the university didn't prioritize my wellness, my safety, and I'm not prioritizing the university anymore. So a lot of different feelings and concerns led to a great deal of employee resignation. Okay, so let's talk about burnout. And the first slide that I included, and I should have made it bigger, but these are the results from the survey that I sent out. We had 40 responses, and the vast majority said that you are not experiencing burnout right now. And then we had about almost half and a half, a little more, said, yes, I'm experiencing burnout. And then we had a group that said, not completely sure what burnout means in this context. So let's talk about what that means. So, burnout has no medical definition or status in most countries. Jonathan Malisic, who wrote a book on burnout last year, he said that saying you have burnout is similar to saying you're an artist or you're a Yankees fan. There's no real definition that people agree on what it means. The ICD-11 says burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Um, and really the difference between burnout and demoralization in this definition lies in who are you expecting to successfully manage that? Are you expecting employees to successfully manage the chronic workplace stress, or are you expecting the workplace to successfully manage that? But we'll talk about that more. So, a definition of burnout is probably going to depend on who you ask and what they need it to be. So, I have some examples. A worker might say, I need burnout to validate my experience and explain my exhaustion, my discomfort, and the fact that I'm not performing well. An employer might say, well, burnout, I need it to explain low morale, low productivity, high turnover, high attrition. Perhaps I need to identify underperformers. A marketer needs it to justify expenditures on products and services. Maybe you're marketing webinars on burnout. A researcher needs it to predict behavior, to illustrate those social trends. A clinician says, hey, this is a new era of therapeutic practice. I'm going to put up a shingle and I'm going to be a burnout therapist. So it really depends on who you ask and what they need burnout to be. But by and large, there are 3 dimensions identified of burnout. One is feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion. One is increased mental distance from job or feelings of negativism or cynicism. I saw a lot of that during the pandemic. And then reduced personal efficacy or ineffectiveness. So typically, burnout has those 3 dimensions. We know that burnout has an impact on our brain and on our body. Decreased creativity, loss of concentration, problems with memory recall, problem solving skills, problems with interpersonal relationships, health problems, headaches, etc. these are all things that we really needed during the pandemic to figure out how we were going to take things online and how we were going to continue to serve students and get their accommodation needs met. We needed to concentrate and be creative and use our problem solving skills. And yet we were in this state of burnout that didn't lend itself to that. So Jonathan Malizek says the dreary familiarity of most writing on burnout shows how our collective thinking about this problem is stuck. We keep reading and writing that same story despite the harm that story is causing us. Many authors tell people who already feel worn out and ineffectual that they can change their situation if they just try hard enough. And this is one of the big problems with burnout. So this is a slide on the culture that creates burnout, which is our culture. If we look at what's going on in our culture with labor economics and profit motives, outsourcing and temping, a growing service sector, our work is often tied to social, moral, and spiritual flourishing. Work in general is often tied, we believe that our work dignifies us. We need to work in order to have character and values. Um, Hustle culture. So this is an interest of mine. And Brene Brown, who is a researcher at University of Texas at Houston, she's a social work researcher. Um, I that was one thing that I did during the pandemic was I read all of her books and looked at all of her research, and that was an untapped area for me that was really interesting. But she tells a story about when she was gathering some research in Texas. She went down to the legal district where all the lawyers, where all the law offices are, and she rode elevators up and down for hours during a week, different times and whatnot. And she got on an elevator at one point, and there were three lawyers, youngish lawyers, on the elevator. And one of them said, "Man, I didn't even go to that game I had tickets for last night. I was here until 8 o'clock." And another one said, "Oh, only 8 o'clock? I was here until 11." And they turned to the third one and they said, "Well, what time did you leave?" And he said, "Haven't left yet." And there was this pride, like he won the burnout battle, but there's no trophy. It's like he had spent the entire night there. He had not gone home from the day yesterday. And that was some level of pride associated with that. So we have this burnout. I mean, we have this hustle culture, and I'm not sure where burnout fits with that. Sometimes it seems to be prideful and sometimes it seems to be shameful. Um, and then of course, who benefits? And of course, who benefits from our culture of profit motives? It's the people with the money. It's the people at the top who benefit. So the paradox of burnout, that it's a negative condition. I think everyone would agree it's a negative condition, and yet workers seem very eager to apply it to themselves. It seems to imply that you're extremely committed. It seems to be that busyness equals some sort of status in a work-obsessed world. Burnout maybe equals ambitious, rugged, the ceaseless hustle, and possibly a self-praise. And the picture here is of a calendar that is just completely filled with all kinds of obligations and commitments. And, somehow our culture has come to revere that and feel like maybe that's a good thing for someone to be that busy. And this is so interesting to me. This is a Subway ad by the company Fiverr, and it was an ad campaign they read called "In Doers We Trust," where they were comparing doers with thinkers and saying doers are the ones that get it done. So this shows a woman who, I don't know, maybe looks a little harried, but it says you eat a coffee for lunch. You follow through on your follow through. Sleep deprivation is your drug of choice. You might be a doer. Is this a burnout hero or a burnout victim? it would seem in this ad campaign that they are saying that this is a good thing. It's a good thing that you only had coffee for lunch. It's a good thing that you're not getting any sleep. You're a doer. Um, I don't know that that's the hustle culture that we want to actually perpetuate in our society. So some of burnout's unintentional messages. And these are things that I came up with. I heard myself say some of these things. And when an employee comes to us and says that they have burnout, we might say, well, it's too bad you couldn't be more resilient. Or that may be the way that they hear what we say. If only you had more stamina. If only you had conserved your personal resources sufficiently. Well, I guess you aren't as tough as your colleagues. Or maybe if you set better boundaries for yourself. Are you using your time wisely? Work smarter, not harder. Have you tried deep breathing and yoga? Maybe a massage? You should take better care of yourself. Perhaps therapy would help. So, when we identify burnout as being a problem within the individual, we give some of these unintentional messages that honestly, some of these, you should take better care of yourself. You should draw better work, personal, personal life, work life boundaries for yourself. The problem with that is that it's localizing the source of the problem, which is burnout, within the individual. It's saying that that person is lacking or they're doing something incorrectly. And that means that the onus for fixing the problem is on the individual. So it is perhaps well intentioned when we say, well, why don't you take a mental health day? But it is also perpetuating the idea that they need to save themselves and that somehow that's going to work. Somehow self-care is going to take care of the stress at work. If only they do that better, they could handle work more. And this is one of my favorite quotes ever by Chelsea Prax from the American Federation of Teachers. She said, "You can't deep breathe your way out of a pandemic. You cannot stretch your way out of terrible class sizes. You cannot individual behavior your way out of structural problems." And so, what this made me think of was Stella Young, who said, unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago. But she was a disability rights advocate, activist, and she said that quote, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude. The reason that's bullshit is no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. No amount of standing in the middle of a bookshelf and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn all those books into Braille." And that's what the quote by Chelsea Prax made me think of is we are localizing the problem in the wrong place. And it's a form of victim blaming and victim shaming. And before we move into demoralization, I wanted to mention toxic positivity. Um, I never heard the term toxic positivity before the pandemic. And I definitely heard a lot of toxic positivity coming at us from higher up, but it is a dysfunctional approach to emotional management that happens when we don't fully recognize negative emotions, particularly anger and sadness. One person said it's positivity given in the wrong way in the wrong dose at the wrong time. So by downplaying or disregarding someone's negative emotions, we think that we're helping someone. We think that we're showing a silver lining, but we're really invalidating their authentic human experience. Things like, don't worry, be happy. Or during the pandemic, it could be worse. What if blah, blah, blah? It could be worse. What if half of our office caught COVID at the same time? Or look for the silver lining. We've got our help. If I can get through this, so can you. I heard that during the pandemic too. So one of the things that Brene Brown talks about in her book, Dare to Lead, is the Stockdale paradox, which is an example of toxic positivity. And the Stockdale paradox was named after Admiral Jim Stockdale, who spent 8 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He was tortured more than 20 times during his imprisonment. When asked who didn't make it out, Stockdale replied, "Oh, that's easy, the optimists." And he went on to explain that the optimist would believe that they'd be out by Christmas and Christmas would come and go. And then they'd believe that they'd be out by Easter and that would come and go. And the years would tick by like that. They died of a broken heart. And when Brene Brown talks about this, she talks about how, they might say, let's think about all the things that will be on the table at Christmas dinner when we get home for Christmas, because we're going to be out by Christmas. And, think about all these positive things, but it just made it harder when they weren't out by Christmas. So she talks about having this gritty faith that you can prevail despite the gritty facts of reality. And so that's not pulling, it's not introducing sadness, but it's saying we can get through this. It's not fun, but we can do it. We can get through it, but it's reality. And one of the things that it makes me think about is all the talk of the new normal and how great things would be when we came back from the pandemic. I found that it was much harder to readjust coming back. And I think for my office, it was much harder to readjust coming back and for the institution than it was to actually break when we went home. Demoralization. So this is a graphic of a woman with her head in her hands and clouds kind of swirling around. So I have a quote from Doris Santoro, who was an educator, a teacher of K-12, who wrote a book titled Demoralized in 2018 before the pandemic. So this is pre-pandemic. She said, America's of educators aren't burned out. We are demoralized. The solution lies in understanding the difference. So when this group was asked about demoralization, um, uh, it was about 50-50. It was close that folks said yes, folks said no, and then there was a smaller group of folks that said not really sure what that means in this context. So we're going to find out what it means. So in our field, I think that people who go into the work that we do, and perhaps, but definitely people who stay in this field, it's not an easy field, and the compensation does not often make it worth it. But I think that we have a moral reason. We have morality tied to the work. We have a sense of social justice that keeps us here and keeps us fighting for equal rights for students. And so demoralization happens when you've got that morality tied to your work and you're in situations where you have these ongoing value conflicts that you can't resolve. It's systemic. It's about the toxicity in the system. It's caused by systems in place that we can't control. And it's when we're forced to operate in these systems that aren't functioning properly. The policies and the conditions make it impossible for us to do what we feel is good and right and just. And that occurs when, the result of that is that we feel that we're complicit in either a disservice to the student or a disservice to the profession. So demoralization is when we say, the university has tasked me with carrying out, equal access for students, but they've not given me the authority or the resources to carry that out properly in a way that I can feel good about, in a way that I feel like is truly good work. That's when demoralization happens. I took a few slides out, and so I'm sorry if these are not numbered correctly. So when we think about contrasting burnout and demoralization, burnout implies that personal issues are impacting or impairing a person's professionalism. You need to go take a couple mental health days and come back. Demoralization implies that professional issues are impacting or impairing the ability to do good work, and that affects them personally as well because they're tied to doing good work. And Doris Santoro said, the sense of powerlessness to protect the profession they love felt devastating and overwhelming. And that, when she says they love, she had these weekend retreats for teachers who were feeling extreme burnout. And she would have them come to these retreats and talk about burnout. And she began to say, this is not burnout. This is demoralization. This is something different. So, survey results in terms of things that were identified by folks in the group, um, in the survey that I would call demoralization were things like over enrollment without hiring additional staff or enrolling more students without staff, angry students and parents and their expectations, faculty needs being prioritized above staff needs, threats of lawsuits and complaints, and actual lawsuits and complaints, that access is not shared as a responsibility on campus, the heightened need to document, to offer appeals, or to just say yes for retention purposes, being given the responsibility without the resources or the authority to make it happen, isolation, university decisions made without staff input, but then expecting them to deal with the ramifications, and the lack of opportunities for advancement. I would say low compensation was also a huge one. That was actually the largest one for this group, was the largest complaint for this group. But all of these things contribute to demoralization. I would also say the landscape of privilege around accommodations, spending time responding to complaints instead of being proactive. We are working on some language in our office for work when parents, typically parents, are yelling at us on the phone and will not listen. And we need to say, if you're unable to control your voice, I will have to end this call. And then we do end it with an invitation to talk when they have had the opportunity to calm down. And it is really sad that we need to take time out of our day to write this language, to even consider, because we're getting so many of those calls that it's so demoralizing to our staff to have to be yelled at. It happened last Friday. We had a staff member who was yelled at for a significant period of time by a couple of parents. And so that's demoralizing. The scams and the scandals, the trying to tease out preference and comfort from need and disability, hiring freezes with high turnover and attrition rates. We were able to get a job that we had been asking for years, and then we had another one frozen. So we still had the same number of staff for a period. Parents, therapists, and lawyers joining student meetings, isn't that a kick? Um, yeah, I had a lawyer, actually, a family had their lawyer join our welcome meeting, which is supposed to be a very pleasant welcome meeting to discuss accommodations. First time I talked to the student or their family, they brought their lawyer, and Zoom makes that possible. And then managing parent and student expectations. And this is just sort of, what does disillusionment mean? The dissing of disillusionment. So I just kind of give examples here of how we feel disrupted, distended, disjointed, disempowered, disregarded, dismissed, disputed, and all of this leads to the disillusioned. And I don't think I have a slide about it, so I hate that I didn't include this slide. I must have overlooked that. But there's a quote that talks about it talks about when we're thinking about the difference between burnout and demoralization, when someone has been burned in a fire, two things need to happen. They need to treat the wound, but they also need to put out the fire. And what's happening in our offices is that we're telling people, go and take a couple of days, take a couple mental health days, come back. And we're not doing anything to put out the fire. So we're saying, you go treat your wound. That's not our responsibility. You go treat your wound. And then we're ushering them right back into that fire, right back into the same fire where they will get burned again. And so looking at demoralization and the systemic nature of it is saying people have to treat their wounds, but how do we put this fire out at the systemic level? There was an interesting article in Inside Higher Education in December of 21, when your job interferes with your work, that says your job is governed by the rationale and systems of exchange which allow you to get paid for your labor. To put it perhaps too simplistically, your work is the stuff that feels vital and necessary to the underlying purpose of why you labor. And I think that's a place where this hits us so hard, because the job is all of the forms that we have to fill out and the paperwork that we have to do and all the notes we have to make. And but the work, the real meat of what we do, the underlying purpose, is what becomes threatened with demoralization. And a quote from that article is, the solace of the work is no longer sufficient for the degradations of the job. There was another quote from Doris Santoro from one of her teacher retreats, where the person said, what I realized at the end of this retreat, this burnout retreat, was that I'm not tired of teaching. I'm tired of all the BS that goes along with teaching. I'm tired of the way the school controls what we teach and how we teach and everything, and teaching to the test. That's what I'm tired of. I love teaching and I still love teaching. Tired of the BS. So how do we remoralize? How, if what we're dealing with is demoralization, what does remoralization look like? And here's a clear sky picture. Let me check my time. Okay, I think we're good. So this is something interesting that I came across from the Institute for Collective Trauma and Growth. And what really struck me about this, it's phases of collective trauma response. And I think a university, a community college, an institution of higher learning absolutely is a collective, a community that goes through a trauma like the pandemic together and emerges from it together, learns from it together. And so I thought this was so interesting. We brought this out in our office periodically, and we talked about what sudden impact looked like for us, what our heroic phase in our office looked like. There was a time when we were, really concerned about each other. Are you taking care of yourself? How's your daughter? How are you doing with trying to be a teacher at the same time, a teacher and a parent, and all the time while working, um and then started going into this disillusionment phase, and kept kind of going further down as the pandemic wore on. um and then eventually coming into a sort of a leveling out, plateauing with that, and starting to build back up. But what's so interesting here is that the estimated time period is 24 to 60 months. So we're a year out. Well, we're 2 years out from returning from the pandemic, but 5 years to come out of this collective trauma, to rebuild and to enter this wiser living phase. And so we found that this was just an interesting tool to use in our office, to kind of post every once in a while and say, hey, where are we? What are folks thinking? How are folks feeling? What's it looking like right now, using this as a kind of a guide. So remoralization is about taking back our moral agency. Moral rewards are a natural, renewable resource that is found in doing good work. I think that the secret here, the trick here, is the way we think about good work. We engage in good work when we believe that, one, the work serves a social purpose that contributes to the well-being of others, and two, the way the work is conducted is aligned with that social purpose. Um, and the fact that good work is not done in isolation from others. And sometimes that makes it easier and sometimes that makes it harder. Um, Doris, Doris Santoro, her strategies for remoralization in her book talk about an authentic professional community being at the center or at the base, and sort of radiating out from that. But the fact that being around like-minded colleagues and identifying allies builds that sustainable base and supports us. It lets us talk about professional values instead of personal ones, and it allows for more anonymity, for more vulnerability. Um, we can cycle through different resources and experiences, and it's the basis for our professional ethics. And it's a sounding board, not an echo chamber. It's where we can put something out there and get responses that are different from our own. We don't put it out there to hear the same thing necessarily, but to ask for ideas, to ask for help. And definitely what you have with a community college system, is an authentic professional community that can be a base of strength. Um, did I just go to? No, I just went one. So this was something that Doris Santoro in her book, she has a different graphic, and I didn't copy hers completely. Hers is much more interdynamic, but I used her graphic as a jumping off point to say one of the tools that helped me when I was thinking about remoralization and am I going to continue to do what I'm doing and can I love what I'm doing again, was to break it down into the areas that she identified, which were student-centered action, collaborative leadership, activism, and voice. And so being able to say I'm working directly with students and to build out some ways that I'm doing that. It's important to me to meet with students one-on-one. It's important to me to see students in our office and to feel like I hear the student's voice and I have that experience. So thinking about in what ways am I student centered and thinking about new and different ways to provide collaborative leadership, conferences, mentoring. Mentoring was one of the things that helped me get through the pandemic, connecting with other professionals, even new professionals. Um, and then activism, taking a stand on something and reminding yourself that your voice counts and that your choices do help shape the future. Even if it's something small, even if it's like right now, the Rise Act or something like that, saying my voice is important, and then finding ways to elevate your voice, finding ways to put your voice out there to say, my voice has an interested audience. These are the ways, this is just something that helped me when I was kind of at the depths of demoralization to say, I need some tools. I need some things that I can do, that can show me that I'm going to be okay and I'm going to feel better. So increasing professional regard and moral agency, enriching connections and building allies, and fostering a renewed sense of purpose. Um, Now this I added, this I did not have in there last year. I don't know if folks have heard about quiet quitting. There have been some articles in Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle. And so quiet quitting, the definition that I found was opting out of tasks that go above and beyond one's assigned duties and or becoming less psychologically invested in work. And I hear quiet quitting used in positive ways, and I hear it used in negative ways. The positive ways are employees drawing better personal, professional boundaries. and saying, when I'm at home with my family, I'm not going to check my email. I'm not going to respond if someone from work calls because I'm not working. Something like that. And that's what this quiet quitting, it doesn't really mean quitting, but it means saying I'm drawing firmer boundaries. Um, so we see that employees are unwilling to go above and beyond as they may once have done. They're unwilling to stay late or to arrive early or to take on additional tasks. They're drawing those lines. It can be related to setting those better boundaries. Job descriptions often don't capture the full expectations of the job. And there was an article I was reading over the weekend on quiet quitting that said the dangers of quiet quitting. Sometimes you think you're not expected to do it because it's not in your job description, but you are expected to do it. And if you don't, it's going to be problematic. So maybe having that discussion, what does my job description really capture the things that I'm supposed to be doing? Um, and actually one bullet below that where it says look at job creep is when you begin to take on all of these additional job duties and roles because of attrition, because someone leaves their job, or because things are reorganized. And so you begin to it actually becomes a job that one person can't do. And so looking at how job creep, how has that affected what you're doing at work? Does your job description still describe that? And if not, maybe it needs to go through at Clemson, its classification and compensation. Maybe you need more compensation for your job. Um, but but to speak to the two bullets above, the disengagement may actually be worse than the employee actually quitting. So an employee may become so disengaged and so psychologically uninvested in work that their productivity, their attitude, the investment that you're making in that employee, really, it would be better if they did go and somewhere else and do something else. Um, sorry, I just got try to speak a little faster from my speaking coach. I somehow turned on. Um, so stay interviews. I don't know if anybody's experienced this, but what a great idea. Invite employees to indicate under what conditions they would continue in the job or they will continue in the job. I would love it if I was invited to have a stay interview by somebody in HR. We had something kind of similar during the pandemic, but removing the hustle from the job descriptions and promoting what's called job crafting. And this is a new concept for me, but job crafting is inviting employees to take a look at their job description and say, here's where job creep has affected some things, but also say, if you could craft some things into your job, what would it be? Or out of your job description, what would it be? Because sometimes those things really are possible. Sometimes they are not impossible and they can be done. And how great is that if an employee gets to do what they want to do? I can't see the future slides, so I think this is the last one, but I may be wrong. Um, and then again with remoralization, there's a quote from Doris Santoro: to anything is to remind yourself of why you do what you do and for whom. It feels like there is an again coming. So thinking about remoralization as returning to your why you do the work that you do, reconnecting with your authentic professional community, whoever that may be. And I have to throw it out there that during the pandemic, I asked Carol Funkus of Ahead at that time. I said, can we just have an Ahead members knitting and crochet group like during lunch one day a week where we talk about how we're dealing with the pandemic, but we're also doing our crafts? And she said she gave me permission to send something out on the listserv. And we started this group. It's an unofficial AHEAD group of knitters, crocheters. We had sewers in there. We've had needle pointers. But we get together once a week. We're still doing it. We named the group Unraveled. Um, and it's the same group of people. It's about 8 of us that come together. We show what we're working on. I knit. Some people crochet. We show what we're working on, our projects. We support each other that way, but we also talk about what's going on in our offices. And a couple of people retired since then. So they get to kind of catch up with people. It has been the most amazing support group ever. And it just happened, we all got kind of thrown together. And we called it our No Crying Alone group during the pandemic. And we said, nobody cries alone. Reach out to somebody from our Unraveled group. And it was really amazing. And that was part of my authentic professional community during that time, and still is. Revisit what it means to do good work in difficult and uncertain times. Recommit to your purpose and to standing in your integrity. And then resilience. But I think it's worth asking, in what areas do I need to practice maybe more acceptance, flexibility, perseverance, the things that I like to see in my students and employees? Sometimes it's about mindsets versus skill sets. Sometimes you need to change your attitude as opposed to changing what you're doing. But this is important. I think sometimes we need to use resistance. I think that's how we create systemic change when everything else has failed. In what areas do I need to stand firm on my professional and personal boundaries? Um, to access my moral center and to maintain my integrity. And I'll give an example from the pandemic where I found it necessary to practice resistance. And that was when I was handling any disability related, medical related requests to not abide by the mask mandate on campus. And so if a student was saying, well, I have asthma and I can't wear a mask, that student was sent to me. And we figured out either a mask they could wear that we would approve, or we figured out how to do it otherwise. We figured something out. So at one point, my supervisor asked me to handle religious exemption requests for mask wearing. And I said, I wouldn't even know where to begin. I know about disability and accommodation and access. I don't know about religions and when someone should be exempted and when they shouldn't. And he really pushed on that. And he said, well, you're already doing that. You're already doing the mask exemption request. So just do these as well. And I said, no, I absolutely refuse. I will not. It is not part of my job. It's not going to be part of my job because I can't do it. I can't do it well. So I'm not going to do it. So, and he found somebody else. I think he got the dean of students to do it. But I think that there are times when we need to practice resistance and we need to say, that this is my boundary. I'm drawing a boundary here. And if that's outside of what we can work with, then it's outside of what we can work with. Let me see. Okay, couple more. Similarly, Doris Santoro says cultivating resilience is an important achievement and builds an individual's capacity to face life's challenges. It calls for us to accept, accommodate, adapt. As a response to demoralization, calls for resilience can be experienced as ineffective and insulting. Strategic resistance may be necessary to address the institutional, systemic origins of a moral problem. Oh, this is the last one. So this is the survey results regarding systemic change. So when asked what systemic changes need to take place, responses include increased pay, increased respect, increased budgets, increased resources, increased staffing, increased buy-in from faculty and administration, opportunities for advancement, formalized education pathways that lead to this work. Very few certificates, like undergraduate certificates or graduate degrees are direct formalized education pathways to where we are. Making accessibility a shared institutional responsibility, realistic workload expectations where you can actually get the work done that you need to get done in a day, flexible options for staff, remote work, flexible hours, etc., and inclusion in the larger conversations and decisions that are happening that affect the work that we do. And I believe that beyond here, yes, it is sources slides. So we have articles on the first two slides, and then we have books on the third slide. And I didn't mention Simon Sinek. His book is the last one on this slide, Start with Why, How Great Leaders Inspire Everyone to Take Action, which was well before the pandemic. He even has some YouTube videos that are just wonderful to watch about going back to your why, and highly recommend reading Simon Sinek if you get a chance, or looking at his TED Talk. He has a great TED Talk. So I will open it up for questions, discussion. I'm not sure